In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, I would like to welcome our dear guests and also our panelists for this first theme that we are going to discuss, which is the response of the Gulf states to COVID-19. And we have the first participant, Dr. Nayef Nazal al-Shammari. He is going to present a paper about the GCC state's response to COVID-19 and its economic implications in light of a double blow that took place. We're talking about the sharp decrease in oil prices, and also we will be assessing the implications for the future and the lessons learned. Dr. Nayef Ashamari is the Associate Professor in the Economics Department at the College of Business Administration, University of Kuwait, formerly Assistant Dean at the same college. He has been a visiting professor at the Paris School of International Affairs, Sciences Po, Paris. He has also published many books, studies, and policy papers in peer-reviewed Arab and international journals, most recently The Spillover Effect of Government Spending on Banking Performance in Kuwait, Journal of the Gulf and Arabian Peninsula Studies, and Arab Gulf States Sovereign Wealth Funds Between Sustainability and Ongoing Challenges. Dr. Naif, the floor is yours, sir. You have 20 minutes. Thank you. In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, I would like to begin by thanking the organizing committee, and I would like to thank you all for this warm welcome, and I wish this forum great success. So, my paper today that I'm going to present will be tackling COVID-19 pandemic and its negative repercussions. The first negative aspect I am going to tackle is the negative effect on Gulf economies, and I will also talk about the economic policies of the GCC countries in order to respond to the pandemic, and at the end I will be evaluating the efficiency of these policies, especially on the short term. Of course, what will be presented is based on the available data and information. At the beginning, I would like to start talking in general about the global economy. And in light of the COVID pandemic and its repercussions, we can see three main issues. The first one, the parasite, this COVID-19 pandemic actually highlighted fault in the social and economic structures. This fault, this shortcoming, was expected to be there, but the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated these issues. The second thing that we would like to focus on is the uncertainty, the fact that there's an increasing uncertainty and increasing risk. Until the very last night, I was updating my data. So this uncertainty makes it very impossible or very difficult actually to predict. And if you forecast, it is likely that you are not going to succeed in what you expected. And just a couple of days ago, we noticed that there was a new variant, new mutant of COVID, and we saw the effect on the markets. And also, the second thing that I would like to talk about is the fact that states paid incentives and packages in order to revive or boost the local economies. And this is something that was unforeseen and unprecedented. And also, we noticed different response times and the recovery. And this was also based on the economic structures of these countries. So, in general, I can give you specific numbers. We can say that economic growth is less by 3.1 and compared to 2.5 up in 2019. And also the economies, the developed economies were more affected than the developing economies, and also 8.1 reduction of commerce and 5.6 as compared to 5.6 up in 2019, and also the oil prices globally were 30% less. All of these things we saw in 2020. I will be focusing on GCC countries. This is why in GCC countries, the first effect I'm going to see, I will talk about, is the effect on economic growth. We noticed that GCC countries' economies were affected, and there's always a consistency between the growth of the global economy and the economy of the GCC states. But the slowdown or the recession was bigger, and this also affected the GCC countries. And also, if we take into account the GCC states individually, we notice that Kuwait, UAE, and Bahrain were affected the most in 2020 during the pandemic in 2020. And although other states were less affected, the other states had lower economic growth before the pandemic. And this reveals how the structural shortcomings are in these countries. In addition to that, if we look into the finance, particularly the income or the revenue. So this is the slide that I was talking about, and it shows the recession, and also here this is exactly what I'm talking about now, and the effect on the GCC countries. And now I will be talking about public finance, and I will be talking about the revenue. When it comes to public revenue of the state, we noticed that in 2020 they were huge. In Bahrain, for instance, we're talking about 34% less, and we're talking about double digits when it comes to negative revenues. This also reflects the lack of international demand and also the oil prices. And I'll be talking about the public finance, and I will be talking about a comparison here between the pre and post pandemic. We can notice that in 2019 the countries actually had not achieved surpluses. So they had deficits as well. So Oman, Bahrain, to a certain extent, Qatar was in a better shape because there was a surplus in 2019, and this became a deficit. So deficit is actually a consistent problem, but the repercussions of the COVID-19 pandemic deepened the effect. Let us talk about other sectors, the monetary and the banking and the finance sectors. If we compare the pre-COVID pandemic to the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, we noticed that in 2020 the liquidity was higher in GCC countries. This is a good indicator, but it reflects that there was pumping of liquidity, particularly the central banks and the ministries of finance actually injected additional liquidity in the markets, and this led to additional savings. This is a good indicator actually, and also here we can talk about the capital of the central banks in GCC countries were high. If we take into account the failed loans of the GCC banks. In all countries, we had bigger percentages, particularly, or except for Bahrain. So in general, the loans increased, and this is a bad indicator, and this is one of the negative implications or repercussions that is concerning. When we talk about the stock exchange in the GCC, we noticed that because of COVID, there was a difference in the decline. The most affected was Kuwait. The less affected was Abu Dhabi. We're talking about 0.6%. And Qatar Stock Exchange and Saudi Arabia Stock Exchange, there was a slight increase. So we have also the data to measure the stock exchange. When it comes to this aspect, if we talk about the balance of payments and particularly the current, which is the trade balance, mainly the imports and exports, because of the COVID crisis, there was a reduction of oil export. So countries that used to achieve major surpluses in the trade balance actually witnessed a decrease. For instance, Kuwait. And some countries we notice, and also in UAE there was a decline, but some countries moved from surplus to deficit. Maybe Saudi Arabia was affected the most. We're talking about surplus of 38 billion, and we reach a level of 19 billion. So this is a bad indicator. Also, Oman, there was an increase in the deficit of balance payment from 4.2 to 8.7. So, as a result of this crisis, these countries adopted economic policies, and the economic policies to fight the negative repercussions of the pandemic usually focus on the monetary policy or the financial policy. So, also there are some policies relating to the pricing. So when it comes to the central bank measures, we noticed that the central banks adopted measures, unprecedented measures. So even during normal crises, these measures had never been adopted. And also, when it comes to the fiscal policies, there was also some qualitative measures and targeted measures, and these policies had a great effect on how to deal with the results of the COVID-19. So when it comes to the measures adopted by the central banks and the Gulf, so reducing interest levels, and so to reduce the cost of credit or loans and boost the economy and ensure stability at the monetary and fiscal level. In addition to that, the central banks adopted monitoring and supervision measures. For instance, the central banks had some huge credit dedicated to give loans to economic sectors, even with zero interest. And also they reduced some restrictions when it comes to getting loans, particularly in Kuwait. They increased the level of financing of economic sectors. Also, they postponed the settlement of loans for the private sectors and also for the individuals. If we take into account the fiscal policies, the objective was to boost liquidity and economic recovery. So we can talk about the incentives offered to the private sector. Many countries
cancelled loans and postponed tax payment, particularly the countries that have tax payment, also supporting employment in the private sector, and also postponing the settlement of loans. So the postponing the installments, and also other policies included supporting the citizens, continuing with payment of salaries, and also stabilizing the price of basic commodities. In Kuwait, this policy is still ongoing. Maybe in the future it will change, but since March, since the beginning of the crisis, we had stable prices officially by the government. In addition to that, the last part included the reduction of the restrictions throughout the sectors, opening new markets for imports, particularly food imports. Some countries reduced tax tariffs on commodities in order to facilitate the importation, in addition to the fact that some countries allowed companies to operate in different fields, different sectors, particularly to support the response during the crisis. For instance, perfume companies switched to sanitizers, etc. So, based on what happened during the crisis and the repercussions that we saw, we can try to evaluate the response. What happened? And it's also based on the forecasts of the IMF and the World Bank as well. So, based on these forecasts, it was the numbers for 2021, 2022 were determined. In 2020, all countries, with no exception, had a recession in the economy. In 2022, the projection is to move from recession to growth, an increasing economic growth. And also, this is coupled with an increasing demand of oil. And here I'm going to talk about liquidity. The forecast for 2021, 2022 is that the liquidity level is going to be normal, at normal levels. So it is expected to see the levels of liquidity in 2021, 2022 back to normal levels. This is based on the average of this year. And this is what we have seen, and this is to a certain extent positive. A positive indicator, which means that the banking sector environment is improving. Also, if we take into account the loans, we notice that in the UAE, there are some forecasts that the loans, unpaid loans, will increase. Saudi Arabia to a certain extent, Oman also, reduction in Bahrain. There are no figures for Kuwait. This is still a positive indicator based on the situation. The situation of current accounts now, it is clear that there will be an improvement because the expectation is that oil exports are going to increase, and we noticed that countries that achieved surpluses, they are achieving growth, and countries with deficit move to slight surplus. When it comes to the deficit, budget deficit, so this is based on the World Bank figures. So it is clear that the budget deficit as part of the GDP is ongoing 21, 2022, and 2023. There is a relative decrease, but to a certain extent, the forecast for Oman and for Qatar. But we notice that here in the slide we see the red color. So it is not expected to see less deficit unless other measures are adopted, and I'll be talking about these here in the last slide. And I try to be as brief as possible when it comes to summarizing the presentation. So, the COVID pandemic, the negative effect of the crisis is going to be repeated whenever we have another crisis that is similar to the COVID crisis. Why? Because there are structural shortcomings and vulnerabilities at the structural level in the economies of the state, and this is what we have noticed based on the indicators. Even with the improvement in the performance of the GCC countries, the forecasts rely on the increase of oil prices and increase of exports, and also how we can deal with the fluctuations. We are talking about levels of inflation that are that we have not had for decades. So these levels of inflation now, they are talking seriously about stricter monetary policies. All of these things will increase the interest level and will also take us back to recession. So there is a dilemma. So so establishing this balance between the monetary policy and also boosting the economy. This is why it is key to work on economic reforms, especially that the deficit is not linked with the COVID crisis. It just exacerbated this deficit. The deficit is actually linked with how to deal with the crisis. We are still talking about the lack of political will, a clear political will to deal with the public finances. And unfortunately, everybody is talking about cutting expenses as if this was the problem. Talking about expenditures is actually something that needs to be tackled. The direct lowering of expenditures will have negative repercussions on the economy. Thank you so much, and I hope that you benefited from this presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Nayef. I will now give the floor to Dr. Ahmed Aref, who is going to be presenting a paper entitled Social Justice Under COVID-19, a comparative study of health and socio-economic policy responses. And Dr. Ahmed is going to highlight the different responses between the Gulf and the Middle East. And Dr. Ahmed is a public policy researcher at the Doha International Family Institute and a member of the Qatar Foundation for Education, Science and Community Development. He previously worked at the Cairo Regional Office of the United Nations Population Fund. His research interests focus on public policy analysis in the Arab region with emphasis on Gulf studies. He has published many studies, policy papers and reports in peer-reviewed academic journals, most recently Austerity for the Poor and Prosperity for the Rich. With fragile social protection systems in the Arab world, people have constructed their own resilience mechanisms for survival. Dr. Ahmed Aref, the floor is yours. 20 minutes, please.
Thank you, Jawhara, for this presentation. I would like to thank the organizing committee in this center for its diligent work in organizing this important conference. The paper will be tackling the social justice under COVID-19, a comparative study of health and socio-economic policy responses. As a matter of fact, before delving into the subject matter, let's go back to the 15th century, the middle of the 15th century, whereby people talked about the sustainable agenda on the part of the UNGA. Indeed, reviving this issue is very important, and this leads me to the reason why I talked about the policy responses. When the SDGs were launched, the Arab countries and the developing countries attempted to customize these international frames to be aligned with the national legislations, and the policy design issue had surfaced so that these international frameworks can be aligned with our national programs and national plans. This momentum in the Arab world has been exaggerated, whereby some countries provided code of conduct and manuals and so on and so forth in order to design the programs and the plans having in mind the SDGs. I'm not criticizing the international agenda, but just observe this momentum whereby national committees and local committees were established to design the policies in accordance with the SDGs. At the end of the previous decade and the beginning of this decade, the world was compelled to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. So the focus shifted from design to response. Indeed, the international agenda did not provide any crystal clear mechanisms to deal with crises that are of the COVID-19 weight. So the policy response terminology were focused upon. The response was kind of a temporary one, and the pandemic has nothing to do with economic crises or wars that might affect one geography at the expense of another, but it is an international pandemic that affects the health of the individual and the community. Thus, the work, movement, education systems were kind of tweaked in accordance with the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So this paper shall monitor the response and shall deal with the policy response issue, health-wise, economic and social-wise. And here comparing between two contexts, the Mashriq countries and the Gulf countries. The two contexts, or the context rather, in the Mashriq, in the Orient, is a bit similar to the Gulf, taking into consideration some discrepancies within the same country and in comparison with others. However, by and large, we can compare between the Mashriq countries and the Gulf countries, not in or through the lens of the COVID-19 pandemic itself, but through the lens of the social justice related policies, especially the workers related policies. And for us not to philosophize this issue, we would like to talk about a social, economic, and political system that tries to settle the differences between the castes, regardless of the discrepancies, whether they hinge on the caste or the nationality, the culture, the color of the skin, race, and so on and so forth. So here I would like to talk about social justice, and indeed I'd like to talk about the response of these countries in the Gulf and in the Mashriq as far as the health, economic, and social policies are concerned. The time is tight, and thus I would like to focus on the health-related policies. And here I would like to provide you with some examples. But before that, we shall start with the results rather than talk about the key messages at the end of the presentation. Indeed, the big corporates have been supported, the stakeholders that deal with finance and business have been supported. However, similar resources were not appropriated for the SMEs. So, these were the companies that were left behind. They were kind of the losers. There were no radical changes in the social protection policies, whereby the patterns of responses were absent, despite the fact that the vulnerable groups were in dire need of such support and protection. So, in the Mashriq, there were differences between the classes as far as the health issues are concerned. The qualitative kind of opportunities of recovering were confined to the higher kind of classes. There were no focus in the efforts absolutely on reviving the health sector that is fragile in the first place, so that the poor can benefit. In the Gulf countries, the social justice has been entrenched. There were no such discrepancies, especially as far as the health issues are concerned. The Gulf countries provided quality health care for everyone. When I talk about the Mashriq or the Maghrib, I like to talk about the general patterns, but there are exceptions in both. The Gulf countries scrambled to provide the healthcare services, and some were compelled to take the vaccinations, for example, to go to work. As far as the economic support is concerned, in the Gulf countries, there was quasi-justice. Indeed, the SMEs were not excluded, unlike what took place in the Mashriq Arab countries. However, the austerity measures that were followed, including the workers-related policies, undermined the philosophy of social justice in the Gulf countries and dealing with the pandemic. These procedures were, as a matter of fact, addressed from the prism of the expatriates, whereby some of them were laid off. So here I would like to talk about some of the examples as far as the health services response is concerned. Rather than jumping into conclusions without taking into consideration the context, I'd like to put things into perspective because the context is paramount. It governs our way of thinking, and it is structured in a way whereby the policy responses are hinged upon. So, when we talk about the preparedness of the health sector in the Mashriq Arab countries and the Gulf countries, the preparedness of the health sector in the Gulf countries, there was an estimation of preparedness by WHO, whereby countries were categorized from 1 to 5 sustainable capacity or no capacity whatsoever, and all the Gulf countries achieved 4 or 5 out of 5. And this was splendid. And there are different indicators that relate to the health preparedness, and that's why some Gulf countries ranked fourth out of 5 rather than 5. During the pandemic, and due to the preparedness capacities in the health sector in the Gulf countries, the Gulf countries were successful in eradicating the disease, and indeed the recovery rates were above the medium kind of international rate as far as the suppliers are concerned. The stringent policies, the IT infrastructure in the Gulf countries, the applications, and so on and so forth. Especially the tracking devices that were splendid in pinpointing those who were affected by the disease. Indeed, the tests were ubiquitous, and the recovery rates were of an international standards. And in Germany, there was a study that categorized countries that played a major role in the response. Qatar ranked 15. Indeed, it ranked first in the Arab world, and Qatar has ranked 15th internationally. The National Statistics Bureau of the Gulf countries, Dr. Nayef, has alluded to the response, the Gulf response. 81% of the confirmed cases recovered. 72% all across the Gulf was the rate of recovery in comparison with the international rates. So the context of the Gulf countries led to a balanced approach that was splendid as far as the social justice is concerned. The health insurance policies internationally said that we have to step back rather than cover the costs. However, in the Gulf countries, the fees were subsidized by the governments of the Gulf countries, and this had applied to the expatriates and the nationals alike. There was a focus on the low-skilled laborers in the camps that had higher rates of the spread of the virus, and thus these kind of locations were put at the top of the priorities of the governments. In the Gulf countries, hospitals were built for quarantining and for providing care. 1 minute left. Can you provide me with 3 minutes, please? Indeed, in some areas where some of the inhabitants lacked certain documents, the government had also supported them. One of the ministers talked about the provision of healthcare for all rather than dealing with the legality of the provision of health care, and this took place in Lebanon. As far as the health sector in Lebanon, and I would like not to touch upon any figures so that Dr. Gawahir won't interrupt me. By and large, the number of beds for to accommodate the patients were very low, and there is a brain drain in some countries. There is a dire need for more nurses. By and large, and the numbers are there in my presentation. So I'd like to say that the system is fragile, and it has been privatized. And as you know, those who have money, they can be provided with health care, quality one. However, the public sector uh, 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 is kind of weak and fragile. I would like to quote one of the officials: 13 hours on the waiting at the A&E. We couldn't be accommodated in one bed. We were asked to pay this sum of money before getting into the hospital. This took place in Jordan. So in the Mashriq Arab countries, the response to the COVID has been kind of discriminatory. I've talked about Jordan, I've talked about the Gulf countries. In Lebanon, one of the officials said that those who have money can only be treated. We pay in dollars, and thus the patients have been overwhelmed with the cost. So the financial credits that were utilized in the army and in other public institutions tantamounted to those who were used by the populace by and large. And the government has reduced the subsidies to the medications in Egypt, for example, despite the fact that 100 billion Egyptian pounds have been appropriated for the businessmen. The last slide, just half a minute, please. We've seen the discrepancies between the social justice in the Gulf countries and in the Mashriq Arab countries. And as we said, the Gulf countries did great in their response, and unlike the Mashriq Arab countries. In generic terms, the expenditure has been reduced as if this was the solution, and austerity took place. Some people were laid off, salaries were cut down, and privileges, allowances dissipated. And thank you very much indeed for your listening.
Thank you so much, Doctor. We really enjoyed your presentation. Unfortunately, we ran out of time. The last speaker is Dr. Tarek bin Hassen. He is going to present a paper entitled The GCC States After COVID-19 Towards Knowledge Economies in the Post-Oil Era. He is going to tackle the diversification, the economic diversification after COVID, and he will discuss the importance of working on knowledge-based economy. Dr. Tarek bin Hassan is an assistant professor of policy planning and development in the Department of International Affairs, School of Arts and Sciences, University of Qatar. Previously, he lectured in geography at the Humanities Department, the University of Quebec in Montreal, Canada, and the University of Burgundy in France. He has written many books, studies, and policy papers published in several Arab and international peer-reviewed journals, most recently, The Entrepreneurship Ecosystem and the ICT Sector in Qatar, Local Advantages and Constraints. Dr. Tarek, the floor is yours. 20 minutes, please. Thank you, Ms. Jawhara. Today we will be talking about the economies of the Gulf after the COVID-19 crisis and how can the COVID crisis direct the Gulf towards the post
and the economies were to be diversified, and they wanted to head towards a knowledge-based economy. We all know the Qatar national vision and the state of Qatar, focusing on four pillars to include the economic pillar, aiming at transforming the Qatar economy into a knowledge-based economy and reducing reliance on oil and gas. In Saudi Arabia, they have the 2030 vision. In Oman, they have the 2040 vision, and the Gulf countries understand that this transformation is necessary, not uh, only because the oil prices collapse, but also the era of oil is going to end soon. So, based on this, throughout the last decades, the concerted efforts in Gulf countries resulted in the development of innovation and education and research and development. And the latest economic crisis after the COVID-19 crisis uh, made it compulsory for governments in the region to tackle the diversification of the economy. And also, the COVID crisis highlighted the importance of knowledge-based economy. Based on this, this paper aims at presenting the qualities of the knowledge-based economy and analyze how did the COVID pandemic boosted these efforts in the Gulf to switch to knowledge-based economies, and also offering some recommendations. To start with, what is a knowledge economy? In general, a knowledge economy is defined as an economy based on building knowledge using science and technology. Very simply, we can define knowledge economy with economy based on the use and spread of knowledge and information. Here we can see the main differences between the traditional economy and knowledge economy. In the traditional economy, there is a bigger investment in the capital, which is the material capital, and in the knowledge economy, there is a bigger investment in the knowledge capital. And the traditional, we have so reliance on the physical effort, and the knowledge economy, the focus is on the intellectual effort. In the traditional economy, the machinery is the main pillar of the industrial economy, and the knowledge-based economy, digitalization is key. In the traditional economy, the employment is not based on specific skills or high level skills as opposed to the knowledge economy. And based on this, we can say that the knowledge economy relies on five main pillars. The first one is infrastructure based on ICT. So the spread of knowledge economy relied on the development of the field of ICT, particularly with the emergence of internet. The second pillar is the human resources, capable and skillful, and this takes us to the importance of the education sector. The third is scientific research and innovation, entrepreneurship, and a supportive institutional system. And this takes us to the public policies that are key to develop knowledge economy. So, I would like to explain the relation between COVID-19 and knowledge economy. So, the COVID pandemic highlighted the importance of knowledge economy because it showed the importance of knowledge economy. We go back to the main pillars. So the ICT proved its importance since the beginning of the crisis. We relied on remote and distance learning based on internet, computer, communication development, and all these technologies that we have to
The healthcare services were offered also by relying on ICT sector in Qatar. We relied on this application, احتراز, that we use on a daily basis. Number two, the pandemic highlighted the importance of research and development. And this takes us to the vaccination. The stronger countries in terms of R&D discovered vaccines before other countries. Three, the education sector was also mobilized to fight the virus by raising awareness and awareness campaigns regarding the vaccination and the measures. And four, I think this is the most important point in knowledge economy and during the COVID crisis. Just like Dr. Ahmed said, the difference between the performance or the number of deaths and affected people by the virus is tightly linked with the efficiency of policies adopted by the governments when it comes to preventive measures. So it showed the crucial role of governments and institutions, and this highlights the importance of public policies to combat the virus and to diversify the economy towards the knowledge economy. Here, I will be presenting some of the points that were already presented by Dr. Nayef as to how the COVID pandemic affected the economies of the Gulf. The Gulf countries had another crisis other than the COVID crisis. There was a decrease of demand locally because of the restriction measures, the shutting down of malls and most of non-essential stores. So there was less demand and less consumption internally. But at the same time, the Gulf countries witnessed a sharp decrease of oil prices, knowing that oil is the biggest share of the government revenue. And the sharp recession in the world and the reduction in travel led to a reduction in the consumption of oil all over the world. And here in this chart, we can see this between 2019 and the first quarter of 2021. The result, and just like Dr. Naif said, was that the GDP in GCC countries was 4.8 less in 2020, 4.8% less, and it actually was more than the 2008-2009 crisis or the reduction of oil prices in 2014 and 2017. So we can say that the economic crisis during the COVID crisis in the Gulf was worse. So the growth level was minus 3.7% in Qatar and minus 6.3% in Oman. In addition to that, Gulf countries took several steps to fight the pandemic through the incentives and incentive packages, and also supporting the stability of the economy, supporting the uh, institutions and companies and private sector. And despite the fact that Gulf countries were trying to diversify the economy after the spread of this crisis, we can say that the economic crisis that resulted from the COVID pandemic could be an opportunity to focus more on the knowledge economy and the diversification of income sources. If we go back history, we know that the Gulf, the population is not that large, and there's a lot of oil reserves and natural gas reserves. So uh, the per capita income in the Gulf is one of the highest in the world. But all of these figures are going to change in the future. For instance, the demographic growth
in the latest years was affected, and also the oil prices are under pressure. And oil prices throughout the last 3 months increased, but they are still subject to pressure because of the global affairs. So we have the non-traditional sources of oil like shale oil coming from the United States too, as a result of the international concerted efforts to fight climate change and rely on renewable energy. The world is headed towards um, renewables and relying less on the fossil fuels. This is why there is pressure on the oil prices. For instance, throughout the last 3 to 4 months, oil prices increased because of the improving situation, the vaccination, and the inoculation of a large populations in the world. But we know that there are fluctuations in the oil prices, and they are determined by global markets and not by oil producing countries like GCC states. Today, after the WHO announced yesterday that there is a new strain, new variant, we noticed that there was a sharp drop by 5% today in oil prices, in addition to the collapse of global stock exchange. This leads us to another question. Will the last increase of oil prices be sustainable? The answer is no. At the same time, developing a knowledge economy in the Gulf is subject to several challenges. The first challenge is that there's few students in the Gulf who are interested in studying in the field of science and technology, engineering. Like in Qatar University, we have been witnessing a decline in the number of students, engineering students. So, of course, knowledge economy relies on all skills, on professions, but particularly students of science, technologies, and engineering. Two, challenges at the level of education. Education is still more geared I'd like to say there's a problem not only in the Gulf but all over the Arab world. There is no link between education and companies, education institution and companies. Three, the lack of R&D in the services and industrial sector, and also the lack of link between the research and development and the productive companies and the civil society. To end with a number of recommendations. The first one is developing macro fiscal policies and also executing initiatives to strengthening the spirit of initiative and innovation. Three, increasing the efficiency of the government by the ease of making business and using data in order to make decisions based on transparent figures. Four, at the level of education, it is important to link education with the needs of the labor market in order to reduce the levels of unemployment and encourage students to head towards science, technology, math, and engineering, and also offering workshops and courses, entrepreneurship courses. So, as a conclusion, we have some questions. What is the future of economic diversification in the GCC with the recovery of oil prices? Of course, as compared to the sharp drop during the COVID pandemic. Two, what is the future of knowledge economy in the Gulf? Three, the post-pandemic era at the level of the policies and the diversification. Will this era be different than the one before? I do not think we have specific answers, and my proposition to masters and PhD students. Maybe like Ms. Al-Jawhara, maybe this could be a subject of the thesis in the future. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Tarek, and thank you for also respecting the time. The floor is now open for your questions. Dr. Abdullah.
Dr. Yusuf. Thank you for your presentations, elaborate, splendid. Undoubtedly, the COVID-19 crisis has provided a great opportunity to the Gulf countries to tweak the public finance, the local production capabilities, and so on and so forth. There is an alarm that has been clear. Indeed, the Gulf countries are fragile when it comes to the public policies, the monetary, the fiscal, the investment, the workers-related policies, the social policies. It seems that there is no holistic approach. Perhaps we focus on leveling taxes, the investment-related policies, and so on and so forth, but we do turn a blind eye to different dimensions of different policies. Do you think that this is a problem? As the post-oil economies won't be propelled with Moses' staff, if I might say, or a silver bullet. We need perhaps to focus on all the policies, and it seems that there is a gap that separates the policies, because all the policies must move along in a simultaneous kind of fashion in order to stave off the pandemic and any other crisis. Thank you. Ahmed Badran from the International Affairs Department at the University of Qatar, the Program of Public Policies. I have 2 points to raise. I'm addressing them to Dr. Ahmed Aref. First, the feasibility of the comparison you have struck between the Mashriq and the Gulf. Perhaps the contextual factors were undermined, and this might lead to misleading outcomes. So, this is my question. There are contextual differences, discrepancies between the Gulf countries and the Mashriq Arab countries, and you have touched upon some of them. So, these differences, contextual differences, will definitely affect the outcomes of your study. Achieving social justice, whereby in a given country that is rich is pretty much more feasible than achieving it in a different country that lacks the financial resources and the solvency. So, this is my question, because being rich in a given country might allow the provision of smart technologies to follow the virus and to track it and to provide the vaccinations and so on and so forth. So my question is, what's the outcome of this study? Because as far as the comparative approach is concerned, we need to pinpoint any patterns, but you have started your study with turning a blind eye to such patterns as far as the policy response is concerned, because you wanted to strike a comparison between the two countries, two blocks of countries, and you link this to the social justice. You should have compared apples with apples rather than oranges with apples. Thank you. Ahmed Mansour from the Doha Institute. My question is addressed to Dr. Naif and Dr. Tarek. It is the same question, but perhaps I would paraphrase it in twofold. The policies that were followed in the Gulf countries, did they emanate from the GCC concerted efforts? So, did you cooperate in order to have these policies in place, or do you think that they emanated from a bilateral kind of effort rather than a concerted Gulf effort, and how this has affected putting the policies in place, whether the efforts were individual or collective. My question to Dr. Tariq, indeed, the GCC countries and following the international governance systems was a good thing to have. They needed to put into place certain policies and perhaps position themselves within the umbrella of this international governance systems. So do you think that there are certain indications that said that this approach might take place collectively or individually? Thank you. Thank you for your presentations. Thank you for this wonderful session. A question to Dr. Ahmed and another to Dr. Tariq. Dr. Ahmed has talked about the policy responses and he compared the Gulf countries with the Mashriq Arab countries. As a researcher, do you think that the COVID-19 pandemic has constituted a political, perhaps, moment rather than a socio-economic moment because it contributed in driving a wedge between the populace and the government? In the Gulf countries, policies indeed were followed to bridge the gap between the people and the government. Do you think that the pandemic itself, and you are focused on the economic side, however, the pandemic has a political side, the big elephant in the room, as they say, and indeed, it is political par excellence. Another question to Mr. Tariq and the knowledge-based economy. Humans are the source of wealth. We need to build humans, intellectuals, healthy humans. Do you think that this knowledge-based economy is linked to policies that are established, or the culture that ought to be instilled in the brains of our children? The education, I mean. So are we talking here about strategies, plans, policies, or does politics play a role as well in this regard, and culture as well, a long-term culture to change the pattern of culture in this regard? Thank you. Perhaps we shall answer the questions and then we move to another round. Yes, Dr. Youssef has asked all of you the same question. Any volunteer? Uh, it is a good question. The gentleman has asked about the general policies and whether there are problems thereby. I think, and let's suppose that we need to support the FDI. I think the procedures will be kind of streamlined. However, on the other hand, we level taxes on the investors and complicate the flow of the expatriates, and we put restrictions on workers and so on and so forth. So here comes the gap. The monetary policies do contradict the fiscal policies as well, do contradict the fiscal policies at certain stages. So we do have procedures rather than policies. This is my answer. If we have a fiscal policy, the fiscal policies procedures ought to support it in the first place. We have a diversification policy. I can't see any indications to such diversifications. The GDP of the non-oil industries is to the tune of 11%, 12%, and it's still there. So where is the diversification policy? Uh, There was another question that related to the coordination efforts between the GCC countries, especially as far as COVID is concerned. Yes, the trade policies were clear. The export-related policies were coordinated. The re-exporting policies had stalled, uh, but the trade policies were coordinated during the COVID-19 pandemic. As far as the monetary policies are concerned, they are pretty much the same. There are certain nuances as far as the taxation is concerned. In Kuwait, we haven't agreed to the VAT up to this moment, for example, and but the monetary policies are pretty much the same. To a certain extent, yes, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Nayef. Dr. Ahmed Badran has asked two questions to Mr. Ahmed Aref. Yes, let me start with Dr. Youssef. You have talked about the contradictions of the policies, and I do agree with you. The observers of the shift in the policies would agree with you. Some policies do not emanate from a single vision. There is a dichotomy between the policies indeed. In Kuwait, if we look at the health policy inched closer to the social justice, but at the same time, the Minister of Finance had allocated certain shops or certain areas where Kuwaitis can enter and buy certain produce. There were certain Kuwaiti volunteers who prevented the expatriates from going to certain locations where certain shops are there. So I had a paper in the previous forum where I talked about this issue. What took place recently in the response as far as the workers-related policies are concerned undermined the approach in Kuwait. Dr. Badran, I agree with you. I have started with the comparison between the two blocks, but this comparison ought to be hinging on the contextual factors, definitely. These contextual elements in the Mashriq do relate to the differences between the classes. I gave some examples. I talked about the privatization propensities, and but if you look at the macro level, austerity for the poor and prosperity for the rich. This is the title of one of my articles, and it talks about the Mashriq Arab countries. In some countries, when we talk about energy, when you lift or phase out the subsidies, when you lift the subsidies on the leaded gasoline in 92 and you keep it for the 95, then this won't get us anywhere. So there are certain discrepancies, but I've talked about the matter in generic terms, and we need to take into consideration the political factors as well, not only the resources. Some countries had resources, but they were not funneled into the perspective sector. They were funneled in the investment sector rather than the health sector. In the Gulf countries, in my paper, I've talked about this issue, but the time was tight, and I called it the imbalance complex. There is an imbalance, demographic imbalance, economic imbalance that leads to adopting certain approaches following such pressures, whereby social justice can be achieved in certain sectors and is absent in different sectors. The last question, you have talked about the political side of the issue. In contrast, the observers of the policies in the Mashriq Arab countries understands that there is a yawning gap between the government and the people, and this is purely political. In the Gulf countries, yes, the political side is important, but there is also a dichotomy in certain areas. The social contract has been cemented between the people and the government, but if you look at the demographic component, the expatriates and their families and so on and so forth, the recent procedures that took place in the Gulf indeed cemented the fact of instability in the Gulf from the perspective of the expatriates. Thank you, Dr. Tariq.
سوف أجيب على سؤال الدكتور يوسف. أنا موافق معكم 100% أنه في عندنا مشكلة على مستوى السياسات، أنه في غياب للتنسيق بين السياسات المختلفة. يعني مثلا إذا نرجع لاقتصاد المعرفة حسب ما شفنا أنه
knowledge-based economy depends on 5 pillars. So we cannot diversify the economy in the Gulf if the coordinated policies are lacking. Indeed, we need a compass to follow. We need to follow an approach that leads to boosting entrepreneurship, innovation, and so on and so forth. I would like to answer the question of Dr. Shadley, and I'll come back to Dr. Yusuf. The main issue of the diversification efforts relate to the stumbling block, i.e. the rentier economy and the social contract, as Dr. Ahmed has said, in the Gulf countries hinges on the relationship between the people and the governments. Yes, the oil has been a blessing, but it has changed the socio-economic political aspects of the Gulf countries. So the government provides huge subsidies to the subjects, and thus the social contract has been cemented. In Qatar and in other Gulf countries, the government provides vacancies to the nationals in the public service domain, whereby salaries are higher than the salaries of the private sector. And this affects the spirit of entrepreneurship negatively, obviously. Rather than being an entrepreneur and be diligent in building my own empire and so on and so forth, I would just go and have a job at a certain ministry and receive my salary and just sit back and lay my head down. So the issue is to do with the spirit of entrepreneurship, the diversification efforts, and to have into place structural reforms that tweaks the essence of the philosophy of the modus operandi of the Gulf countries. So diversification is important. It is simple, but it is complicated at the same time. It has nothing to do with the economic aspect per se. Here we talk about the political, social aspects and the change of the social contract and the relationship between the citizens and the governments. So here we think I think we need to have the two. We have to have policies and we have to have changes in the public culture. We need to have sound policies in the first place in order for the culture to change. Lastly, the Gulf countries, we have 6 countries that are similar, but at the same time, from our own perspective, they are different. The socio-economic, political kind of nuances are different. In the Sultanate of Oman, they have different challenges than Qatar. As far as the knowledge-based economy and the diversification efforts in Qatar, indeed, Qatar is kind of comfortable because it depends on the LNG, on the gas. The gas is not renewable, but still it is cleaner than the fossil fuel. And at the end of the day, Qatar will be depending on gas, and the whole world will be depending on natural gas rather than the fossil fuel in the future. So we have 3 groups. We have Qatar in the first group because it depends on the natural gas and it is not incurring any huge pressures. There is the Emirates in the second group, whereby its economy is more diversified. And the third group incorporate 4 countries because they depend on oil. Kuwait, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, they do depend mainly on oil. We have also the Sultanate of Oman and Bahrain that are subject to huge pressures, and I think these two ought to have their economies diversified because they have economic, social, and demographic problems. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Tarek. This is the end of this session. We will reconvene at 2:30 with Yaqub Al-Gandari. Thank you very much all, and thank you for listening.